In exploring the medieval romance genre, we should consider the concept of courtly love, which was very important. You know already that love and the relationship between men and women was not necessary for a poem or a story to be romantic in that sense. It could be romantic because it focused on the adventures of a knight who slayed dragons or looked for the Holy Grail, or in the case of Sir Gawain, pledges to have this test of his courage a year hence when the Green Knight sort of charges into the hall of King Arthur. And we still kind of have vestiges of this idea in a really old-fashioned term that I'm sure none of you use anymore. People used to say they were courting. And in romantic comedies, and sometimes in real life, men still get down on one knee to propose. The knight in the illumination at left has given up his helmet, his shield, he's come down from his steed, and he has knelt to show his fealty, but also his submission to his beloved. This seems a logical outgrowth, at least to me in some ways, from the kinship ties and ties of loyalty and friendship that organized medieval society, and we'll kind of talk about how that came about as we move through these slides. The word itself derives from court, the palace and environs where the king and his vassals and all those necessary for its support lived. Just as in Beowulf, when we get to the Anglo-Norman period, the court was set up by a code of chivalry that governed the behavior of those who belonged to it. The term chivalry is derived from Middle English and Middle French, and it essentially means warrior on horseback or mounted men-at-arms, knightly skill, gallant or distinguished gentleman. A code of chivalry was a requisite of knighthood, and some scholars have pointed out that understanding its rules, of engaging in battle, of deference to one's king, of dressing and dining, hunting and jousting, was the only way of moving into this aristocratic world if one were not already born into it. Eleanor of Aquitaine was very, very important to the idea of courtly love. As Duchess of Aquitaine in France, she married Louis, the king, when she was young, and later she married Henry II before he became King of England. When her marriage to Henry became strained, she and her daughter Marie created a court where liberal and literary ideas were discussed and where troubadours and artists made music and delighted in all kinds of entertainment. Between the two of them, Eleanor and Marie created a set of manners that became the standard of chivalrous behavior for knights of the time. They held courts of love where they would test the behavior of lovers to see if they held up to the standards set in Andreas Capellanus's writings, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this little slideshow. Marie and Eleanor thought women should have love in their lives and not merely settle for the marriages of convenience that were typical at the time period. These ideas have certainly influenced the concept of romance throughout the ages. In the detail at left, which is in an abbey in France, Eleanor lies in effigy next to her husband, Henry II. There's a really old film starring Richard Burton and Katharine Hepburn that imagines their relationship and the sort of power struggle between the two that you might be interested sometime if you want to explore their story. Courtly love was love from afar when it worked out best. It was supposed to have a civilizing effect on knights. The prevalence of arranged marriages, and sometimes in these marriages, really young girls would marry older men just for strictly political purposes, and that happened all the time. And so they were motivated to find other outlets for the expression of personal love. One example that comes to me is in Dante's Inferno, where Francesca and Paolo are in hell because they had a love affair. And essentially, I always imagined that her husband, who was Paolo's brother, was maybe older, and you can kind of understand how they would have been reading a book, and their heads leaned close to each other, and they would have fallen in love and not been able to resist each other. At times, and really often, the lady could be a princess lointaine, a faraway princess. And actually, in some of the tales, men fall in love with women whom they have never seen. They fall in love with them basically because they have heard their perfection described. So, courtly love thus saw a woman as an ennobling spiritual and moral force, a view that was in opposition to medieval ecclesiastical or church sexual attitudes. Rather than being critical of romantic love and seeing it as sinful and a temptation, the poets praised it as the highest ideal that a human being could strive for. And in so much of literature, not just then, but throughout the ages, women seem to be portrayed as either Eve or Mary, as Mary Magdalene or as Mary, the Virgin, Mother of Jesus. And oftentimes there's very little room in between. She is either a liar, a person who is all the time trying to shake the strength of men, or she is seen as sort of this virginal ideal that a man can never win, because, of course, if you won her and actually slept with her, she would no longer be worthy of that love. So it was a very highly organized way of thinking about courtship and romance. And just as the code of chivalry was meant to govern the violent natures of men by giving them a king to serve and jousting and all of these games and all these rules of warfare, courtly love was meant to channel their sexual impulses, so that instead of just sort of chasing after any random female, they were supposed to be performing feats of bravery to honor their beloved lady. In telling their tales, then, poets adopted the terminology of feudalism, declaring themselves to be the vassal of the lady, and sometimes they even addressed her as maidens, my lord. The troubadour's model of the ideal lady was the wife of his employer or lord, a lady of higher status, usually the rich and powerful female head of the castle. In other words, someone who was supposed to be entirely unattainable. When her husband was away on a crusade or other business, and sometimes while he remained at home, she dominated the household and especially its cultural affairs. We see this motif in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, though we learn that this is a test of Gawain's honor, that on the third try he ultimately fails when he accepts the girdle of the lady in order to protect him, he hopes, from the Green Knights being able to kill him with the axe. And of course it was a game. And the motif in Gawain also makes clear the dance that's required for playing this game of love. Do you notice that before the knight takes Arthur's place in the beheading game, he very courteously asks leave of Queen Guinevere, to avoid insulting her by leaving her side without permission. Later, when the king's wife at the castle outside where he's going to meet the Green Knight visits him in his room to exchange kisses and maybe more, he has a little bit of a rock and a hard place situation. He really has to remain loyal to his host, or he is not a good knight. On the other hand, he can't make her think that he's not attracted to her or that she's not beautiful or enough, and he can't be seen to be rejecting her. Now, when he and his host talk about this later, and his host says, well, yeah, I see that she gave you her belt or her girdle, and so, yeah, the third time you weren't as strong. It's clear that he sent his wife to test Gawain, and he really doesn't really much care one way or the other what she would have done. It is the knight who must be chaste and strong enough to resist her beauty. She maybe can sin, but his sin is much worse because, well, he's a man. So the poet in these romantic tales gave voice to the aspirations of the courtier class, for only those who were noble could engage in courtly love. This new kind of love, however, saw true nobility as being based on character and actions, not wealth and family history. So you can see why they would be very, very attractive, both among people who were sophisticated and read, or poorer people who perhaps heard these stories through songs and oral performances. How they would appeal to poorer knights and others who hope for an avenue for advancement. There's also a medieval romance, another one about Gawain, that we're not going to read about in this module, but in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. The story is called Sir Gawain and the Loathsome, Ugly, and the Loathly Lady. And it's retold in the story of the wife of Bath, but she doesn't name Gawain in her story. In her story, a lusty knight commits the unpardonable breach of the code, the chivalric code, by raping an unwilling victim. But you might recall from Gawain that we basically get a little foreshadowing of the possibility of this story, because in addition to his host's wife, there are also two other women he encounters. One is young and beautiful, the other a crone. And the story of what happens there then is explored in other romances. The medieval historian Barbara Tuchman, in her book A Distant Mirror, The Tumultuous 14th Century, identified the stages of courtly love, and just like a dance, it's very organized. First, there is the attraction to the lady, usually via eyes, a glance, a dropped kerchief, or a dropped flower. First, the knight worships her from afar. Then he declares, perhaps through letters secretly delivered, his passionate devotion to her. And because she has to be worthy of that passionate devotion, of course, she has to reject him at first. She cannot be too easy. So I guess some things never change. When she rejects him, he renews his wooing with oaths of virtue and eternal fealty. And sometimes there are moans of approaching death from unsatisfied desire and other physical manifestations of love sickness. We see this in Thomas of England's story about Tristan and Isolde. Heroic deeds of valor which win the lady's heart. And then sometimes, not always, they consummate their secret love. I always thought that one of the best things to happen in some of the movies I've seen about Lancelot and Guinevere is the one where the director restrains him or herself and does not allow the consummation of that love to go beyond a kiss, because of course that is enough. The betrayal in that particular instance is the love itself, but it's also a love that was meant to inspire Lancelot to greater feats of valor, not the betrayal of King Arthur, whom he is pledged to serve and love. And of course, in some of the ones that are a little bawdier and a little less, a little more risque, there are endless adventures and subterfuges to avoid detection by those who would catch the couple, and they would end up being punished for their sin. If you're interested, you might look up Andreas Capellanus. He's the one I talked about a little bit earlier who lived in Eleanor of Aquitaine's court. At the urging of Eleanor and her daughter Marie, he wrote down a set of rules for courtly love, and I'm not going to list them here or the discussion that went with them. They're very misogynistic. If she's supposed to have been looking for women to have more freedom in love, he really says a lot about women being faithless and women not being trustworthy. And I remember reading the book when I was in college the first time I quit and then came back like some of my students did. But I remember when I read it, the scholars in the introduction of the edition I read took him as deadly serious. But I remember just rolling over and laughing at some of the things that were there, and maybe it was just that they didn't translate well. But the consensus among scholars now seems to be that he could very well have been being satirical, but maybe he wasn't. The lover, he says at one point, is to prefer the pleasures of the upper part to the lower part. Well, my body, young adult brain imagined all kinds of double entendres there. But maybe he simply meant that with courtly love, the lovers were meant to prefer the pleasures of the mind and the pleasures of the heart, and the adoration from afar over carnality and consummation of that love, which of course often led, just as it does now, to destruction and tragedy and hurt and pain to others that are loved. Because, after all, I guess, unrequited longing can result in either the death of the swooning lovers who die in each other's arms. But, if you can survive it and remain chaste, I guess that is a lot of energy that the knights could redirect into jousting, killing infidels, or finding holy cups and slaying dragons, which is how in the other romances they seem to have spent their time.